welcome to the Lewiston Tribune podcast. This is episode number 24. I'm Matt Baney, managing editor of the Tribune, and I'm joined today by Laura Guido, our political reporter down in Boise. Laura, how are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm surviving.
And Laura is roughly 2/3 of the way through the legislative session, maybe. Does that sound right?
Yeah, we'll see. They're aiming for March 21st, but I haven't heard a lot of confidence that's going to be met.
So it sounds like it could go longer than that.
Yeah, it definitely could.
Okay. Well, it's been a newsy week down at the Idaho Legislature. Laura's been covering it, and we're going to talk about that today. Before we get into it, Laura, let's talk, first of all, probably the headline this week out of the state legislature was the signing of the school choice bill by Idaho Governor Brad Little. And that broke on Thursday, that Brad Little had signed that into law. Please tell us a little bit about the school choice bill.
Yeah, so the bill is going to cost $50 million. It allows parents to apply for up to $5,000 per student, or if it's a student with disabilities, up to $7,500. And that money can be used for educational expenses, which could include private school tuition. This is the first time that Idaho will have allowed state money to go to private K-12 funding launch, which is a separate grant that goes towards higher education that can go towards private schools. But this is the pretty new in the K-12 space. Its sponsors, Representative Wendy Horman and Senator Lori Den Hartog, basically have said that, that public education doesn't work for everybody. Parents who want to send their kids to private school should get a little extra help since they pay taxes too. People who have opposed it, which has been a lot of people in the kind of public school sector, like the Idaho Education Association and the School Boards Association and kind of those groups, and then just kind of other groups as well, have said a number of things, but they've talked about, Idaho is constitutionally obligated to fully fund public education, and they argue that we're not doing that adequately yet, so that the state shouldn't necessarily be getting into another realm of education without meeting its constitutional obligation first. They argue that money isn't as accountable as public education because private schools don't have to necessarily report outcomes, or they don't necessarily have to take students, like for instance, if they have disabilities or make accommodations, whereas public schools do have to do those things. So it was definitely the subject of a lot of debate this year.
And Brad Little had a news conference on Tuesday. Of course, he was asked about will he or won't he sign it then. It seems to me that he's always very close to the vest when he is considering a bill. Is that your impression?
Yes. Most of the time when we ask him his thoughts on a bill, if he hasn't signed it, he says that he doesn't comment on pending legislation. At the news conference on Tuesday, he was asked about it several times. He didn't necessarily say if he thought it met his kind of requirements for something he would support. In the state of the state, he said he'd support something fair, accountable, and transparent. There might have been another one, I can't remember, but definitely those. And he mentioned that it maybe wasn't as accountable as he wanted, but then he kind of went on to say that maybe public schools aren't accountable as he would want it for the money they've received for other things. So he he did say something like the only thing that it fit into perfectly was his $50 million box that he set up for the legislature, but then he signed it, so he obviously didn't have too many problems with it.
Just observing him on Tuesday, did you have a guess which way he was gonna go or not?
Um, my guess was he would sign it because he did in his State of the State address say he was setting aside $50 million for school choice. Um, I was curious if he was going to say if it meant one way or the other, if it met his requirements that he had kind of set up. Sometimes he'll send transmittal letters when he signs something, so basically means he'll sign it, but he'll say I have these concerns about it. But there was no transmittal letter or anything. He just signed it and seems to be on board. So
He also had set up, once it passed the House and Senate, he had set up a hotline where people could vote, which, as far as you remember, had he done something like that before with a piece of legislation?
I had not seen it, but I'm told that's been done before.
Okay.
Basically, just when they're receiving so much input, their staff can't really take the time to take it one at a time. If your next question is going to be about what the results were, uh, we don't know. Multiple reporters have asked, and they've just said thousands, and they're still compiling it. And I know that a number, including me, but several reporters have filed records requests for that. So we'll hopefully find out soon.
Yeah, and it is interesting. It makes me think if he asked for votes, he must not have had his mind made up, or maybe that was, maybe just, could that be a PR move on his part? Hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, he was asked about it on Tuesday, and he mentioned that providing the input was or receiving the input was important to him, but that he wasn't necessarily going to vote based on he mentioned we're not a direct democracy, so he wasn't necessarily going to vote exactly how he received the input, but he still wanted to know. But again, we don't know yet what those results were.
Okay. Well, it is now the law of the land, so we'll see how that goes ahead getting implemented and everything. I guess should will that take effect then next school year? Will parents be able to tap into those funds to send their kids to private school?
I believe so because I think it goes into effect July 1st. And some families that meet a certain income threshold will be able to get it as like an advance. So they wouldn't necessarily have to wait till they file their taxes and get a reimbursement, but they could get the money in advance. So I think that is the case. Although there has been litigation threatened under it, so we'll see what happens with that.
Okay. And then here at the end of the week, there was a bill about changes to expanded Medicaid here in the state. Can you tell us a little bit about that measure, Laura?
Yeah, so there were a few. Um, I guess one really early on in the session was just a straight out repeal, but that hasn't moved anywhere since January when it was introduced. But there was another bill that Representative Jordan Redmond introduced that would it required the Department of Health and Welfare to receive 11 different waivers from the federal government, which are what you have to do if you want to make changes to your Medicaid program. It's a federal program, so you have to get permission to do it, basically. Um, if they didn't get any of those waivers and implement them by a certain date, which I think was at some point in 2026, then it would trigger a full repeal of Medicaid expansion. So at this point, there's about 83,000 people enrolled in that program, and they would just immediately lose healthcare coverage. And that bill passed the House and has been awaiting a committee hearing in the Senate. Um, there was some maneuvering yesterday, so Thursday, where there were like some committee members who tried to bring it up for a hearing because the chair had been holding it. The chair was absent. They were ended up ruled out of order because the bill wasn't before the committee to make a motion, so it didn't end up coming up. But there's definitely a desire from some folks on, I think they're members of the Freedom Caucus, or one of them was, but some folks on that side that are really wanting to hear that bill. But there's another bill that's been introduced this week, that's Jordan Redmond is also on that one, and he's working with Senator Julie Van Orden, who chairs the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. It would make changes to Medicaid as a whole. It's a big, complicated bill. It would do a lot of different things. Some of the things that he was trying to do with the Medicaid repeal trigger bill are included in this one. That includes like work requirements, some changes to how often they determine if you're eligible, looking into moving more of the people on it onto like private insurance or the healthcare exchange. It did remove some of the more controversial things, like his first bill had an enrollment cap. There were a lot of questions on like, well, the cap he set was at 50,000 or this number of adults with disabilities and adults who are age 65 and older, which that would reduce the cap to like 35,000. So there's a lot of people who would be, you're already over that cap now. So how do you choose how to disenroll people? So there were a lot of questions about that. He tried to put in a lifetime limit on services. So if you're on Medicaid expansion for more than 3 years, then you'd be unenrolled. Things like that, that people were like not so sure if we'd be able to do that under federal law. So those are not included in the second bill that came out. And it would also, and you can stop me if this ever gets boring, because I could talk about this bill all day, unfortunately. This bill would also move the management of Idaho's entire Medicaid program to managed care. Currently, we're on something called value-based care. It's something that we created here kind of locally in Idaho. We've been doing it since 2022. There was a task force that looked into this a couple years ago. At the time, they decided to stick with what we're doing, but this would be a pretty major shift in how we do it. We'd contract with like a third party private organization that would oversee all of Medicaid. And it might not be one organization. We could have contracts with several different organizations. They're not really sure how they would do it yet, but it would be a pretty major shift, and it would probably be some really gigantic state contracts if we do go forward with this.
So it really still quite a bit to figure out. It'll be interesting to see if any sort of one of these bills ends up getting pushed through this session. Do you have any sense of the likelihood of one of these coming to fruition?
So House Bill 138, which is the one that would trigger the repeal, it made it through the House, but it was a fairly narrow margin. And it's, unclear how that would do in the Senate. I talked to Senator Van Orden today, and, she's the chair of the Health and Welfare Committee in the Senate side, so it's kind of up to her if it comes up for a meeting. And she told me it's still alive. But I do think she wants to see how this second bill goes, because it wouldn't trigger a full repeal of the program. And I think that's more the direction she wants to go. She's in agreement that maybe there's something that needs to be done to try and control costs within the program, but she's not wanting to take away health insurance suddenly for a lot of people. I believe last I heard there was supposed to be a hearing on this new Medicaid bill on Tuesday. So guess we'll see where it goes from there. I'm not sure Um, I do think it addressed a lot of the problems that people had in debate over the other bill, but I guess we'll see where it
Mhm.
goes.
Okay. Well, with an eye towards that possible conclusion of March 21st, although that maybe seems unlikely, what other maybe major issues is the legislature perhaps going to tackle before they wrap up?
I'm sure there's a lot, but the one thing that they constitutionally have to do before they can leave is set the budget, and it has to be balanced. And one thing that's kind of interesting about that is, in order to set a balanced budget, they have to project what their revenue will be, so they have a number to balance against. And normally they do that at the beginning. They have this whole committee that talks to economists and comes up with a plan, and they come up with their um, agreed upon number. The committee did that, and the budget writing committee, JFAC, didn't agree with it. They floated a couple different numbers. Some people wanted a higher revenue projection. They thought we were going to do better. Some people wanted it to be a little bit less based on their ideas of what's going to be going on this year. And also, I think there's some people who just want it to be more, so there's more room in the budget for different priorities. They have not been able to agree on one, so we have set a number of budgets. The budget committee has passed a number of budgets out of committee, and some of them have gone through one side or the other. None of them have totally passed, but we don't really know what that revenue number is going to be at. I mean, I checked with the chief legislative budget analyst today, and he said that no number's been set yet. And I asked if it's possible to go a whole session without setting a revenue projection. He said he's never seen it. So that's something they're going to have to do. I'm assuming before they set some of the bigger budgets, like Medicaid, public schools, things like that.
Okay. Well, that'll be interesting to see play out too. Um, Probably the other big news this week in the state, politics wise, didn't happen in Boise. It happened at Coeur d'Alene last weekend, actually. There was a Kootenai County Republican town hall meeting, and it made national news what happened. There was a woman in the crowd, a woman who had been from Post Falls, who had been a Democratic candidate for office, hadn't won, and she was heckling some of the lawmakers from the audience, and ended up the being confronted by the Kootenai County Sheriff, and then hauled out by private security officers, and ended up, uh, as I said, that made national news. Here's some video of her getting hauled out. And so, Laura, down in Boise, that was the talk of not just the state, but it kind of folks around the country heard about that. What did anybody down at the state house? What were they? Did they talk about that at all? What were their thoughts on that episode?
Yeah, Governor Little was asked about it on Tuesday when he had the press conference with legislative reporters, and he kind of said he didn't really know much about it, so he didn't really have a comment on it. I do know that it was Representative Redmond who's running these Medicaid bills. He prior to that uh, town hall, he had received a bomb threat, which I think was some of the reason for the enhanced security there. And he did mention that earlier in when he proposed this new Medicaid bill. He said that it was not in response to the bomb threat, because he said he wasn't going to be swayed by threats of violence. In terms of the incident at the town hall, I know I've seen tweets about it from representatives. Representative Heather Scott has tweeted about it a couple of times. In one of them, she tried to blame local media. I'm not really sure in what way. She wasn't really clear on how it would be their fault, but um, yeah, it's definitely been talked about here.
And I should mention that in that incident, the woman bit one of the private security people, and was originally charged, but those charges have been wiped away. And the security firm actually, their business license been pulled because they didn't. There's a Coeur d'Alene city ordinance that passed that security firms have to be clearly, their people have to be clearly marked with security on their clothes, and they weren't. Um, and the woman's GoFundMe has, at last check, had raised over $300,000. So this incident probably isn't concluded. There'll probably be some legal maneuvers in it. And anyway, it was interesting. It's the whole thing is um, too bad that Idaho gets known for that nationally, I suppose. But anyway, that was some of the big news this week. Um, okay, Laura. So you are getting near the end of the session, we think. Uh, so far, what do you think of this? Is now the third legislative session you've covered for in Idaho, right?
Yep.
Okay. So far, what do you think we're going to remember about this session? What are the big takeaways from this one? And I know there's still probably lots to happen.
Um, well, there's a lot of new people this session. I can't remember the exact number of incumbents who lost their seats in the last election, but it was like 25 or something like that. So we have a lot of new faces. I think some of them have been a lot more active than freshman legislators usually are. A lot of them kind of take a session to sit back and watch the process, run some agency bills. But I would say some of the new folks are pretty engaged and running bills and doing debates, and they're pretty active. um, I think the school choice thing will stand out. If something happens with Medicaid, it'll definitely stand out. I mean, on the entire Medicaid program, there's like almost 300,000 people in Idaho enrolled in that. So that's going to affect a good chunk of Idahoans if something changes there. It's hard to say. We've also had, like every year, there's a number of kind of culture war type issues, a number of bills that kind of push the boundaries on separation of church and state. For instance, there was a bill to require Bible reading in schools, to require the 10 Commandments be posted in schools. Those are both things that have been challenged in other states. So if any of those go through, there's definitely going to be some legal questions there. There's a bill kind of taking aim at drag shows that's advanced through the House. Not sure where that's going to go, but it's supposed to limit, like it's called sexual exhibitions, but there's some language in there, and the Idaho Family Policy Center, who ran it, has kind of specifically said that they had concerns about drag shows in particular, and that's what they're look at public ones like in parks and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see where those go, because again, the opponents of it have some First Amendment questions on that.
All right. Well, Laura, thank you very much. We're talking here on Friday evening where you are. It's, of course, been a long week. They're all long weeks. So thank you very much for your time. I know you're probably ready to relax and enjoy a weekend before you get back after it. But thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the Lewiston Tribune podcast. We'll be back again next week with a new topic. And until then, have a great day. Thank you.